Their rendition of this first Motown song to reach the #1 position on Billboard Hot 100 Pop Singles chart was so successful that the critics said that it almost makes the original sound like an imitation. But you have to remember, these were the same which criticized the Beatles when they first made their way to the US.
All right, well then I've got to check this out. So, Please Mr. Postman is the debut single by the Marvelettes, and as Vlad told me, reached the #1 position on the Billboard Hot 100 Pop Singles chart in December 1961, and it also hit #1 on the R&B chart. Now, the Marvelettes were an American girl group, while the Beatles were a British guys band. Now the question is, what did the Beatles do to this song to make the American audiences interested in a young white British group's cover of a black R&B pop hit? Well, let's see. I am first going to listen to the original recording by the Marvelettes, and then I will listen to the Beatles cover. And as is my habit in this Beatles 150 series, I will listen to both of them unbroken. After I've listened to the Beatles version, I'll go back and we'll do whatever listening repeats and interruptions we want to do. I guess the Beatles weren't the only one to think of something letter-themed in their music, because obviously this was not a Beatles original. And this original version really does sound, to my ears, American. The accent, the voice, everything about it makes me think American style. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it translates to the Beatles and their version of it. I still don't enjoy this term cover. To me, that seems rather dismissive of an individual or a group's artistic contributions to a piece of music. Maybe it's my classical background and the idea that there's so much that the performer can bring to the music. It's not merely about who wrote the music. Anyway, just a side note. So, and this Marvelettes, that's a band I've never heard before, and she's got quite a voice. Whoever the singer is, I should probably look into them at some point as well. But for now, we'll leave it at that, and I'll move to the Beatles version. Definitely a contrast between the original and the Beatles version. One of the things that stands out to me is that in the original, in the Marvelettes version, their sound is a lot more, well, even the singer is a lot more throaty, husky sounding, and the instruments, the band behind the voice has a lot more, how should I say, thump to it. There's a roundness to the sound that is very blown up. And here in the Beatles version, it's straightened out a lot. It is definitely not the same sort of style singing as the original Marvelettes version. It's straightened out a lot. It has more of the thin, pointed Beatles sound quality, but at the same time, it's kind of more directed in its drive. It feels like, well, if I could put a visual to it, I guess I would say the original one sounds like it could be a broad river that's rolling along, and this one is more focused and more channeled and directed. There's a charging ahead quality to it, even though it doesn't have the thicker, fuller texture and sound of the original. Very unique distinctions between the two. So it's not just a copy of the original. A couple other things that stood out to me, I guess I'll mention them now, is obviously it was a girl band that did the first version. And they sang A Letter from My Boyfriend. And I noticed the Beatles switched it up. I guess maybe they didn't feel too comfortable singing A Letter from My Boyfriend. So they said A Letter from My Girlfriend. That moment is... It hit me really, really... a big surprise at first because my headphones were turned up so loud. It was like, oh boy. Stop him in his tracks. Make him stop and please check your bag once more. Let's see if there's a letter. Wait, Mr. Postman. I notice a lot of their voices singing back and forth. There's a lot of dynamic conversation, musical conversation in this song. Right from the very start. Let's hear that first. I guess it's kind of the refrain at the beginning. Really? That's what we listen to. Listen for. That's what makes it compelling. This idea of, as you call them, covers. If somebody composes or creates a piece of music and they perform it as well, then somebody else comes along and takes it. They haven't been the ones to invent it, so to speak, but they are going to perform it as well. And to make that compelling, it has to be a performance or an interpretation, a take on it that makes it one's own. So that it's not simply rehashing and copying and repeating what has already been done. And I guess the Beatles did a pretty good job of that, because comparing the two, they are very distinct one from the other. And the Beatles totally own this in this performance. And I am remembering what Vlad told me at the beginning, that the critics said that the Beatles made the original look like a cover. That's what you call a really fine performance, when no matter who wrote the song, who created it originally, if it sounds like it belongs to you, if you perform it, if you communicate it in a way that is very much your own, and doesn't feel like you are giving a recitation of somebody else's work, well, there's a very fine performance. And that's what I'm keeping my ears open for here. It's a way of them owning it, such that, yeah, they're guys singing on stage, and they want letters from their girlfriend. That little moment right here on Please, Mr. Postman, is you hear in the accompaniment just a little interruption of the motion that has been going on. It's as if they are singing, well, I've been waiting so patiently, I just want a card, just a letter. It's the expression of their feelings as they wait, and the time goes on, and the music goes on underneath it. And then just a slight interruption to the texture as we get to Please, Mr. Postman. But I heard something much more obvious a bit later in the song, which I'm going to point out. But notice what happens here. You saw me circle something in my first listen of this Beatles version. Later in the song, we'll get to it. But to really appreciate when it comes, notice the way a card or a letter is sung here. By leaving me a card or a letter, Mr. Postman. Rather British. This is being expressed as if it's all the postman's fault that we haven't gotten a letter. it's an interesting way of expressing the feeling of desperation and the desire to hear some word. I guess I've never really thought of blaming it on the Postman, but here it's a unique take. The Beatles don't make it sound so fun. They make it sound very urgent. I guess this is one of their less playful sounding songs that I've heard so far. It's not a feeling of, oh, let's get out and dance and have fun. It's not feeling like, let's play around. Of course, it's not their harmonies, right? So they're not playing around with all the harmonies. They're not experimenting with all these things. And the lyrics aren't their own, so they're not coming up with creative little twists on common ideas. They're also singing it in a very, as I said, focused, driven, directed. It's like they're driving this feeling home of urgency and desperation. The Marvelettes was more extroverted, I would say. More playing around with the idea. Now the Beatles aren't playing. They're rather serious about this. I've got to have a letter. Mr. Postman. Listen to what has been building up in the instrumentation behind the voices, especially as we get into this wait a minute. And the guitar, the drums, everything behind it has this sort of moto perpetuum, perpetual motion feeling of ching, 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 just driving. Wait a minute. It's like we're feeling like we're just not letting up on it. Doesn't let up until check it and see one more time. And there the music halts a bit, as if we have persuaded the postman to stop and dig into his bag and see, did you miss a letter at the bottom of your bag? Pretty persuasive, guys. It's not just the instrumental interruption, but it's also the addition of those little hand claps in there that give it a completely different texture for that moment. When the postman is persuaded to stop what he's doing, check his bag, and see if there's something there. All right, going on. And that's what I noticed first time round, is the deliver the letter, the sooner the better, and the word isn't finished. They rely on the fact that they have set it up for us ahead of time, and of course the anticipation of the rhyme, letter, better, is built into us, and he doesn't even bother to sing it. Instead, he jumps into, you gotta, wait a minute. Gives it a sort of breathless feel, like we're running after the postman, and you've got to deliver the letter, the sooner the better. Wait a minute. I didn't catch that on the Marvelettes version. I think that's a Beatles twist. That was a fun listen. Actually, a fun comparison of two different versions of this piece of music. And they each have their own charm, their own quality. But I do have to say that I feel like the Beatles have really owned this piece of music. They took it, picked it up, and walked away with it, basically. These are some of the little things that I noticed as being, I think, their own insertions and their own creative twist, while still remaining true to the original composition. And a very fine job. Now I'm going to answer a couple questions from people who've written on my channel comments. But before that, I want to say, if you enjoy this and you haven't already, please think about liking and subscribing to my channel, because it really helps support my journey. If you want to do more than that to support me, you can always check out my Ko-fi and Patreon pages. So today's question, or rather questions, this one comes from Mr. 88. And he wrote, when Amy says the Beatles 150 series is she going to react to 150 The Beatles songs? The answer is yes, that's the plan. I am at number 16. This was the 16th. I guess I'm a 10th finished. So I hope you enjoy the ride. And the next question comes from Peter Obelrich. And he says, my goal in life now is to live long enough to listen to her get through their whole catalog. I'm so glad you're enjoying it, Peter. I really am happy to hear that my project, which I started mainly for myself, is bringing so much joy and enjoyment to so many people, you included. And your comment reminded me of what Vlad tells me about his father. And one of his big regrets is that his father didn't live long enough to watch this series and see this series and discuss this series. He said if his father were here today, he would love to bring him in and have him sit down and talk with us about this whole project. Because, as you know, the Beatles are among Vlad's absolute favorite bands, and he got that love from his father. And that music meant so much to both of them back then and to Vlad now. And I guess from hearing his stories, I can understand why you want to live long enough, Peter, and I do hope you do, and even longer, so that you can continue to enjoy Beatles for a very long time. One more question from Omar Domenech. He asks, are music theory and musical notation universal? Or would it be more proper to call it Western European music theory and Western musical notation? In other words, are there sounds present in Asian, African, Middle Eastern, or other musical traditions that can't be adequately expressed using musical notation and that wouldn't really align with music theory? If so, to what degree does using Western definitions and theories force musicians to think inside of a box and limit their ability to see, well, hear beyond it? And I have to say, absolutely, Omar, you are right. And it is true that there are many, many musical traditions around the world which have no connection to Western musical notation. Some of them are purely passed down orally from generation to generation. Others have their own ways of preserving and notating the musical instructions. And there are many, many sounds which are not embedded in Western musical notation. Furthermore, even within the Western musical tradition, it is impossible to visually notate every single sound and sound variation, even within Western music, on paper. Think of it more like a shorthand set of maybe cliff notes of what the outcome should really be. These are the cliff notes, and out of that, we gather enough clues, enough cues, to then take that music and, as I just said a moment ago, make it our own. And that is very much a significant part of the art of classical music, because unlike rock music and other modern musics, classical music, or more correctly, as you say, Western art music, has been around for centuries and centuries. And that means we do not have the luxury of having recorded the composer's, the creator's own renditions. And so the best we have are their little notations trying to express what they had in mind. And we take those and we pick them up, and our goal is to take them, lift them off the page, and bring them to life. I'm looking forward to hear more questions from all of you, and I'm looking forward to the next rock music experience. I will see you soon.